All right, so we are now in a position to begin the Iowa City City Council work session for Tuesday, July the 2nd, 2019. For the information of people watching on TV and people present in the room, I need to report that Mazahir Saleh once again will not be present. She's still in Sudan. We've had some communications with her, but they've been fitful. We don't really know what her situation is right at this very moment, but she will not be participating, via the telecommunication system tonight. We certainly hope that she is well. Okay, so our first topic for tonight's work session is an update on climate action activities, including a review of emission data post-Mid-American and UI, University of Iowa investments, and state law limitations on certain actions. So we've received some information that appears in our information packet, the most recent one that we received on Thursday. But the staff is going to begin, I think Brenda is going to start by making a presentation, a PowerPoint presentation about what our emissions situation is, what's been done so far, what's currently scheduled, and that kind of thing. And then I'll ask Eleanor to brief us on the state energy code and how it relates to new buildings and what our authority is and is not. After that, we'll open things up for questions to the staff and dive more deeply into the whole topic. So, Brenda? Good evening.
Good evening. Brenda Nation, Sustainability Coordinator. I've been asked to give a brief presentation about some of our most recent climate data that we've been working on and an update on what the city's been doing in order to give you more detailed information so you can have your discussion tonight. So Iowa City has been working on climate action and sustainability for quite some time, but we really stepped it up when the mayor signed the U.S. Compact of Mayors Agreement back in 2016. And we've been coordinating our efforts more intensely since that time over the last 3 years. We also got a 4-star rating with the Star Community Rating System that showed that we scored very well, but we needed to work on our climate actions. And then in December of 2016, the City Council set targets, carbon emissions targets for us, which kicked off creating a plan to get to those targets that took 1.5 years, and it was completed in September of 2018. The plan was intended to be updated about every 5 years. We have tracking tools to give an annual update. It's been 9 months since we completed the plan, and we hope to be giving an update that will be available to the public in about 3 months to show what we've done in the last year. We also have a community toolkit that's online, so people can look at best practices on how they can reduce energy in their home and at their work. And we also have some back data on how to track some calculations and scientific efforts on how to calculate these so we know how to get to the goals. The plan had community input. We had a community steering committee that was created to help create the plan. We had stakeholder engagement before we started. We had 2 public meetings that had about 100 people each, and we had a survey that included over 800 responses. So we had roughly about 1,000 people give input on the plan because we wanted to be relevant to what we could do in Iowa City. So as far as the target goes, Iowa City adopted the Paris Agreement targets. I'm sure the mayor remembers that we went and discussed what some options would be with Dr. Jerry Schnorr. And at the time, he recommended, and it was best recommended by the IPCC, the agreement set by our country at that time, which is 25 to 28% by 2025 and 80% by 2050, and that's from 2005 levels. So we adopted our plan in September 2000. just last year, 9 months ago, and then 3 months later, the IPCC came out with a new recommendation of 45% by 2030 and 100% by 2050. So that happened just 3 weeks after we completed our plan. So the idea of getting to 100% in 31 years is going to take transformative change. I mean, if you think about getting off all of fossil fuels in 31 years, we're talking about major change, not by just the city, but by everybody in the community. So this is the data that we've been working with. We calculate our greenhouse gas inventory in-house. We use the most up-to-date global protocol standard that's recent. We back-calculated all our prior years so that it's comparable to the new standard. And so we have 11 consecutive years of data to look at our greenhouse gases. So we can, we've been monitoring them. Although you can monitor the data, it's no guarantee about what you do, but you can make better decisions on where your emissions are and what to do about it. You can see the top red line is the baseline emissions from 2005, and the next dashed yellow line is the 2025 target that was in the plan, and then the darker line is the projected 45% reduction should you choose to do that. And then the lower line is the 80% reduction. You can see that we're ahead of schedule, and we are currently at 21% reduction from our 2005 levels. The last year that we have calculated, it takes 6 months after a calendar year to get all the data to calculate. And you see that we had a little blip up in 2018. The reason for that is that we had some climate extremes. We had colder winters and warmer summers, and we'll probably, with the work that we've been doing, that we are expected to see more of those. So you can see that they do vary through the years, but it's going to get hotter and will require more electricity, and it'll get colder too, so we'll require more heating. So we also conduct our city operations greenhouse gas emissions. So we want to know what our operations have to do with this too. And so our city operations, so that includes our landfill, wastewater, all of the things that we own and control, are 4.5% of the community-wide emissions. So while it's important for us to track that, and we have a responsibility for that, 95.5% of our emissions are community-wide, so from other people. So we're going to need community involvement to attack those 95% of the emissions, and that's what the plan was meant to address. So in our municipal emissions, this is from 2015. We don't do these as often, but you can see that our landfill methane from the landfill that we own and operate that accepts waste from the entire county is over half of our municipal emissions. And so we are currently working on a methane study to look at those. Wastewater is our largest facility emissions at 15%, and the water plant is 5.7. So for water use in the city to clean and the water it takes, those are our largest emissions for our facilities. Our other buildings are about 12%. So we track our energy data for all of our facilities. So we have about 300 accounts for natural gas and electricity. And this is a lot of information on this slide, but it shows that we're constantly looking at the amount of natural gas and electricity in our own buildings, and we spend about over $2 million on utility cost in our facilities. Note that the landfill, while the methanes are the largest, the methane emissions are the largest emitter. That's in the production of methane from the waste, not the buildings. And so the facility itself hardly uses any compared to other buildings. So these are our top 10 facilities and the amount of natural gas and energy use that they use. We have done improvements, and we continue to do improvements on all of these. We are looking into the senior center and doing improvements on those, but we have been working on continuing to improve the efficiency of our own buildings. And we have a new software that makes it easier to use this, to look at these, and we're hoping to share it with our facility managers as well. So for our community emissions overview, we have two charts here. The first one on the left shows the source. And so the sources of in 2018, our most current year, the source of our emissions, the majority comes from electricity. So 46% of all of our emissions within our city limits come from electricity, while 29% come from natural gas. 7% comes from just the coal from the power plant, and then transportation is 16%, with waste for Iowa City residents being 2%. So that's where our emissions come from. So the city can't regulate electricity and natural gas. That it's up to the Iowa Utility Boards to do that, and we also can't regulate the University of Iowa power plant. So, but we can have some impact on some of those things. So the chart on the right is by sector, and so you can see that most of our emissions comes from our buildings, and so we have industrial, commercial, residential, the University of Iowa power plant, and transportation, and so. We have a limited ability to regulate consumption and efficiency, but we need to get community action for those areas for businesses, industries, and residential. So our plan is made up of 5 different sections. And the first one is buildings. So buildings take up the majority of our emissions. They are responsible for a majority of our emissions. What the city has done, I'm just going to go over a brief overview of all the 5 sections about some of the activities that we have done since the creation of the plan or in the last few years. We have had city rehab energy audits on our city rehab projects. We have a Mid-American team. It's our 3rd year, and they're working on energy audits around the city. We have energy efficiency grants. We've helped try to support funding for the Johnson Clean Energy District, which is offshoot of some members of our steering committee that have gotten together with some other members of the community, and they're going to be working on energy efficiency in residential to start with and get the word out on that. We have some other grants, including air source heat pump grants to Habitat for Humanity, and air source heat pumps are a way to offset natural gas, and they're going to report back to us on how those work in our climate. We're also installing solar arrays at the new Public Works facility. We've been talking with Mid-American Energy about community solar, and we've done improvements on our buildings, including converting bulbs to LEDs and our street lights to LEDs. I mentioned our energy tracking software. With our street lights converting to LEDs, because Mid-American knew that we are committed to reducing our greenhouse gas emissions, we were the first city in Iowa for them to start working with the ones that they own to convert those. Our staff is also tracking the progress on the state energy code, and we're following the new, what's going to be required for us moving forward. And our current inspections require verifications, but we're also looking into upgrading that in the future if necessary. Let's see. For transportation, which is the second category in the plan, the city has a goal of doubling our ridership in our transit buses, and we have a pending grant for 4 electric buses. We also have been changing out our own fleet to electric vehicles and hybrids. Yesterday, we just found out a grant. I'm very excited about this. We just found out that we're receiving a grant from the Iowa Economic Development Authority, Iowa Energy Office, to work with other cities in eastern Iowa on creating an EV readiness plan. And so that includes Quad Cities, Cedar Rapids, Dubuque, Waterloo, and us. And so we're working with the MPOs in the other cities to get baseline and how to move forward as a regional group to promote electric vehicles. We have many bicycle initiatives, installing bike lanes, bike share program. We've supported projects for immigrant and low-income populations as well as seniors, and we have educational series on biking. We're also monitoring our own city fuel by revising our routes, and also we just passed an idling policy. The third category is waste. We've done a lot in this category. We've just rolled out new recycling carts, multifamily recycling, and increased and started our curbside recycling. The chart here on the right shows that we've had an increase of recycling already this year, and our curbside composting has gone up as well. We have new positions in refuse and landfill for more staffing needs in this area. We've issued a few grants. We've done a consumption-based inventory. We've done several things, other things, including our cardboard ban has been really successful. We have, and we're, as I said earlier, we're conducting the study on methane. So working a lot in the waste category as well. For climate adaptation, we are fortunate to be one of the 7 cities across the country to receive an Urban Sustainability Directors Network grant to get an equity fellow to work with us this summer. And she's working with us on climate adaptation and those that are affected the most because due to climate changes. And she's going to be having a report that's due at the end of the summer. We've also been working with the county emergency management mitigation plan. We just approved that, and we have staffing in this area too with stormwater and assistant park superintendent. Natural areas management we're working on, which is an important aspect of adaptation because of stormwater, invasive species, and trees, other things like that. And we've received grants and completed a plan. We're working on invasive species removal. And we're working with other cities on soil protection program, and we also have been planting in the last 3 years trees on our property. Sustainable lifestyle is the last section. In this section, I meant to mention that the numbers that are at the end in parentheses correlate to the numbers in the plan. So these are the actions that we've taken according to the numbers according to the actions in the plan. So we've created garden plots. We have the grant to the food hub. We have grants. We have several different grants, our climate grants that have gone to local foods and encouraging those within the community. We're working on our communications efforts. We're working with the Climate Advisory Board, of course, and they also have communication plan. And we're working on a sustainability recognition program to help businesses try and get to more sustainable business, especially related to energy. And we're hoping to release that by the end of 2019. So we have been working with university partners to get to create a climate festival that we hope to hold for the community in 2020. So the numbers. So if you recall that 95% of the community-wide, that's the important part, and that's what we're going to need to get to. So we've already gotten to 21% reduction. And so if we look at our baseline from 2005, and we've gotten to 21% reduction already, we only need 2% a year to get to 45% reduction. So we created a scenario that's not, that's just a hypothetical scenario of a reasonable plan of attack to see if we could get to there. Mid-American has proposed that they will be getting to 100% renewable electricity for Iowa customers by the end of next year. So in a year and a half, we'll know what amount that they reduce. And so just to be conservative, we added 85% to see what that added up in case that it's slower than suggested or that they don't go to 100%. If the University of Iowa, they made a formal commitment to get off coal at the power plant 100% by 2025. We don't know at this point whether they're going to be replacing coal with natural gas. But if they reduce their coal emissions by 50%, we added that as a part of the reduction in this scenario. So for building retrofits and electrification that would replace natural gas, if you recall, natural gas is 29% of our total emissions, but if we were able to reduce just 20% of that, that is the number of 58,000, and these numbers are in metric tons and CO2e. So if we were able to get to that amount in natural gas, which is pretty conservative, and the numbers on the right are the numbers that would remain after those reductions. So if we increased transit ridership and reduced our transportation emissions by 10% in this scenario, and then also reduced our methane emissions at the landfill by just 50%, if we add up all of those totals for that scenario, we would get to well over 45%. And so assuming that our partners in Mid-American and the university were able to do some, we would still need to do some of these things to focus on these three main areas. Our existing building stock. Our existing building stock is our most efficient way to look at our emissions for natural gas and for energy efficiency. So we need to look at natural gas replacement and electric vehicle adoption. So the city, as I have said, has budgeted some additional staff in some of those categories. We're going to continue to work on our own building efficiency and performance, transportation, with the focus on equity. And in the future, we could look at more detailed energy code inspections and building incentives. That, as you know, the city can't do it by ourselves. We're just 4.5% of the emissions. And so the community, we need to work with the private sector, and we need to work with a wide variety of partnerships to get there. We work with the Climate Action Advisory Board, and their recommendation is that we work externally as well and to connect with external partners. And they are thinking about a possible shift to a formal commission. And the climate strikers have requested three different things: emergency declaration, revising the plan targets, and additional staff. So it's clear that we need to do more, especially if we're going to get to higher targets, and to work with the community is one of the ways that we can do that. This word cloud is from example of 40 different community partners that we would need to work with and focus on. So with the plan, it's a framework. There's no finite end. The IPCC targets are going to change probably often and vary. Our own emissions are going to change and vary. And so the plan is very adaptable. It's the numbers that we have are to get to 80% reduction. And the main point is that we need to strengthen our partnerships to get there and to work on those key things. We hope to plant seeds, plant grant funds to help seed working with the community, and it's just really partnerships to get to that transformative change. Thank you.
Thank you, Brenda. We'll have questions for you in a few minutes, but before asking Eleanor to talk about new buildings, I want to acknowledge the presence of at least 6 members of our Climate Action Advisory Board. I want to thank them for their past work most of you were on the steering committee, if not all of you. And thank you for coming here tonight, too. Eleanor, can you bring us up to date on whether we can adopt more stringent energy standards than the states for new buildings?
Just to summarize quickly, when I initially looked at the provisions in the state code, I saw fairly strong preemption statements in the state code. And I can go through that analysis if you want me to. It's all in the memo. As there was discussion about it, and we saw that both Dubuque and Des Moines had adopted energy codes, or international energy codes that were later additions than has been adopted by the state. The state has adopted the 2012, and they have adopted the 2015 to the extent that they're more stringent than the 2012 code. It made us question that conclusion. And so we were communicating, or other staff was communicating with the state anyway, and was about what their plans are for adoption of the 2018 International Energy Code. And I asked them to inquire about what the state, or at least their contacts at the state, thought about the preemption issue. And the original take we got on it was, well, they thought we could do it, we could adopt more strict requirements, but they would get an opinion from their attorney. Subsequent to that, I communicated, as I stated in the memo, with General Counsel for the Department of Public Safety, and she looked at the provisions and also communicated with the Building Code Commissioner, and they were both of the opinion that we were preempted. Now, I would not typically rely on a state actor to tell me what, or rely on the opinion for preemption from a state actor, but my hope had been, when we got that initial feedback, that perhaps they knew something I didn't. If they saw it differently, then, and the state wasn't going to give us trouble, then we could rely on that. But that did not turn out to be the case. Just generally, there is a provision in the state code that says cities can adopt standards and requirements that are more stringent than those adopted by the state, but not that are less stringent, which is, I think, maybe where that thinking was coming from. But that is as long as another law doesn't provide otherwise. And I think the provisions of Chapter 103A, first the provision that deals with single-family housing, single-family, two-family construction, and then the other provision that deals with all new construction, are such other provisions, particularly when you look at the legislative history of those provisions, how they were amended, the language that they replaced, which did what we would hope. And then finally I gave you the provision, that the bill that was proposed in 2018 that would have allowed us to adopt more stringent requirements, that was not passed.
Okay, so I'm going to read one sentence out of the email from the Department of Public Safety's General Counsel's Office, Attorney Catherine M. Lucas. It's a very short paragraph, but it ends, the City of Iowa City cannot legally adopt anything other than the state energy code. So, I mean, it just repeats what you've told us, but it's a very concise way of repeating it. So that's important for us to know, and it's important for the public to know. Now, what I'm thinking is that we've gotten a very valuable presentation from Brenda, and I think we need to have an opportunity to ask Brenda and Eleanor and Jeff, whoever, questions about what we have done, what we are planning to do. When I say we, I mean the city. What we have done, what we were planning to do. Just ask questions about that without making claims about what we ought to be doing differently in the future. We can get to that in a few minutes, but let's just start with questions. So why don't we start with you, Rockne, and just kind of work our way down.
I think the first question I have relates to Dubuque and Des Moines. So is the DPS commissioner or the chief counsel going to sue them? I mean, I don't understand how they were able to adopt a more stringent standard.
I can't answer that question. And I don't think you should assume that when they did so that they got a legal opinion.
Okay.
As far as I know, the Dubuque and Des Moines city attorneys have not provided a formal legal opinion. In fact, in my informal discussions with them, when I originally started looking at this issue, they were of the same mind that I was. So I can't tell you what, I mean, when I asked Ms. Lucas about that, and she said, they can't do that. What they're going to do about that, if anything, I don't know. My guess is nothing, since the state is getting ready to adopt the 2018 code, and they'll be in compliance.
That was my primary question.
Okay. John, do you have any specific questions you want to ask?
Well, I did this question of what would be allowed under the, if the state were to adopt the 2018 edition of the International Energy Conservation Code, would that get us where we want to go? I'm not familiar with what that code would allow.
I can't speak to the technical requirements of the 2018 code. Tim Hennis did ask kind of generally what they thought the difference was between the 2015 and the 2018. And if you're going to move on for a minute, I can find out what that was. It was 6%, something in that range.
I can follow up on that just a little bit. I'm no expert on that either. I understand from talking with Martha off and on over the years that each succeeding revision to the code is stricter with regard to energy efficiency, stricter with regard to carbon emissions, and so on. So if it's not true, shake your head that way, but understand that's true. They do it every 3 years, so the next one's going to come out in 2021. And I should tell you that I was asked by people at the U.S. Conference of Mayors whether I would be willing to co-sponsor a really aggressive version of what would be adopted in 2021, because there are ways of trying to influence those standards. I talked with Jeff about it some. I talked with Eleanor about it by email anyhow. And they said, sure, there's no reason why you shouldn't co-sponsor that. So I did. I presume it will be considerably more stringent than, well, not considerably, more stringent than the 2018 version, which is more stringent than the 2015, which is more stringent than the 2012, and so on. Will it get us where we want to go? It's a track. Mm-hmm. It's not an endpoint.
So what Tim was told by his contact at DPS, who's Dave Ruffcorn, construction energy engineer, is that residential would be 6% plus or minus more restrictive than the 2012 code, and commercial would be 8% more restrictive than the 2012 code.
That you're talking about 2018 relative to the 2012?
2018 relative to 2012.
Okay. You have other questions, John?
No.
Susan?
No.
Pauline?
Just to clear it up, Eleanor, is it possible to encourage or suggest without crossing the line of requiring the stricter codes, like with new developments? I mean, maybe not going so far as into putting it into CZA, but at least encouraging them, like when we're discussing it with them for rezonings or developments. Can we at least suggest or encourage stronger, stricter standards?
You can suggest and encourage all you want, but you have the ability, but when it comes to the regulations that the city can enforce, obviously that's whatever energy code is applicable.
Along those lines, is there any way that we could do citywide tax abatement for people that wanted to do adaptation, like solar infrastructure on commercial buildings or for residential? Could that be a citywide program for tax abatement?
I think that has possibilities. I mean, the incentives are a whole different issue than regulation.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm thinking we can get into that more deeply after we just ask these preliminary questions.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
what I was asking the question.
All right. It's, I guess from your report and definitely the mayor's reading of the one line from the state, it seemed a little contradictory to me. Whereas, of course, as Rockne pointed out, Des Moines and Dubuque, they were able to do the 2015, and the 2018 is, of course, present now. But I thought I heard you say at one point that we can have a more stringent requirements. Is that correct?
I was quoting a provision of the home rule sections of the state code, which there's a general provision that says cities can't do something less restrictive, but they can do something more restrictive. But there's a provision in there that says unless another law provides otherwise, and that's what you have here.
Okay. And I think that'd be a little difficult to navigate with other laws, because I don't know how we would figure out what other laws could be in opposition, because there's a lot of laws, if we were to create something.
No, what they mean by other laws of the state that would prohibit us even from doing something stricter. And in this case, we have other laws of the state that prohibit us from doing something stricter.
Okay, awesome. And then I know that we received kind of a projection from Brenda with, how can we meet the 45% reduction goal by 2030? And I think when I look at this, I know one of the observations is that we've been relying on Mid-American energy as a part of our reduction. And so even though this exceeds 45%, I do wonder about what happens towards 2050, because between 2030 and 2050, that's only going to be 20 years. And I'm assuming that there's going to be more requirements set on the community. And so on one level, I think this is great, but I kind of like to begin with the end in mind, what that looks like for 2050. Because if there's more community involvement, I think I would like to see how can we incorporate some of those things now, so that it's not so overwhelming in 20 years for individuals. So I think that was my, questions or observations there.
Okay, I'd like to draw attention to one chart and then ask questions about another chart. So could you go back, Brenda, and pull up the community emissions overview, the two pie charts? Yeah, starting with the one on the left. I just want to make sure people understand what that chart tells us. So the 46% on the right, which you label electricity, that means electricity generated primarily by Mid-American at its plants all around its service area. Is that correct?
Yes, and the way that we calculate the Mid-American electricity, well, I should just point out, we have a very small amount from another provider, but it's like 0.5%, so that's why we're not addressing them. They also have some renewable energy. But the 46% is from Iowa City users in all of our buildings from Mid-American Energy, and the way that we calculate it is the conversion factor that we use that we get from them, that what they're counting is that the energy provided to Iowa customers.
Yeah, I'll get to that in a second. So the light and the air conditioning that we're feeling right now in this room is being generated by Mid-American somewhere at its plants, wind turbines, coal plants, whatever.
Right.
All right. And the same's true for all our residential buildings and commercial buildings and all that kind of stuff.
Yes, the only exception would be the university, and some of their buildings are from their power plant and cogeneration. They get some electricity from that.
Okay, the next is the 29% having to do with natural gas. That's primarily natural gas used to heat buildings,
Correct.
residential, commercial, institutional.
Yes.
So it's
primarily
how
for
we heat,
heating.
and it comes from Mid-American, is that correct?
Also comes from Mid-American.
Yeah, thank you. And, yeah, I think those are really crucial points to understand because of some things that have been written and said. Yeah, so there's that. And a crucial deduction one can derive from that is that there's no way on earth we're going to achieve our carbon emission reduction goals, even the ones we've already adopted, unless Mid-American changes the way it generates electricity, and unless we somehow reduce our use of natural gas, we, meaning the people of Iowa City and businesses, and unless the University of Iowa reduces its use of coal and hopefully gets away from natural gas too, right? We
Absolutely
cannot
correct.
unless those things happen. Okay, so can you turn back now several slides to the one about recent annual emission trends? Because this troubles me a lot. I've talked with Jeff about it several times, and we've had email exchanges about it and everything. So the first thing that troubles me is the drop between 2014 and 2015. It's completely inexplicable just by looking at the graph. I'm not, and then there's background information. I think you've referred to how Mid-American has made a decision about, I think it's reserving renewable energy credits
Right.
for its Iowa customers.
Right. Before 2015, they were able to sell RECs, or renewable energy credits, to other people outside the state. And in 2015, they weren't able to do that anymore. So when we were receiving some wind energy before that, but we couldn't claim it because other people were paying for those RECs and they were claiming it elsewhere. And so even though we may have been getting wind energy or renewable electricity, other people were buying it to claim it, and we could not. The Iowa Utilities Board made that pass in the 2015 that they couldn't do that anymore. So the electricity that we're getting for the last 4 years have been the renewable energy that's created within Iowa that can't be purchased outside.
Okay, so
of
the big reduction between 2014 and 2015 is a result of a legal or administrative decision. Is not the result of a dramatic reduction in their carbon emissions.
It's mainly due from the added wind energy that they in the past few years they've purchased wind turbines, and it's their source but it's from their wind energy.
Yeah. I mean,
Right,
I don't mean to be criticizing Mid-American because they have made a big shift to wind. I'm not denying that. It's important. I'm really pleased that they've done that. But what I am drawing attention to is the fact that they did not make a sudden reduction in carbon emissions between 2014 and 2015. They used
As a company in all of the states that they have energy, you're saying?
I'm saying as a physical fact, between 2014 and 2015, they did not reduce their carbon emissions by that amount. Because there's...
I think it's confusing because Mid-American owns and operates a lot of energy in a lot of different states, not just Iowa. In Iowa, they have focused on putting more wind turbines, and it doesn't mean that they don't have coal-fired plants in other states. They do have coal-fired plants in other states, but they've focused their wind energy in Iowa, and they're committing to 100% of wind energy for electricity for the Iowa customers in the state of Iowa. That's what we do our greenhouse gas inventory on. And so what they do outside the state and doesn't affect the electricity that we get in Iowa City. Well, they do have coal outside of Iowa City.
Okay.
So I think that the emissions factor that we use to calculate to get this is from the electricity that we get in the state of Iowa for Iowa customers. That's why it went down.
I think it deserves more careful analysis, but I hear your point. But the other next thing I want to draw attention to is the increase in total emissions from 2016 to 2018. There's been just a steady, very small, but steady increase. And I know there's fluctuation in the past, there'll probably be fluctuation in the future, but the downward trend is what we need, not a slow increase. So that worries me. You know, I'm doing my job up here. It just worries me that we're saying that we've already reduced carbon emissions by 21%, and therefore we're very close to achieving our 2025 goal. I'm not persuaded that we're going to get there.
So you can see in the other years between, say, 2009 and 2010, we went up, but then we went down again. A lot of that has to do with temperature variations, and we will see, to your point, we will see more extreme temperatures, and we'll need more heating, and we'll need more cooling, so we'll need more. We also have a growing population, so those points are well taken. But it will vary, our emissions will vary in time, and it hasn't, at the university, we do get the numbers from them as well, and they have been reducing their coal, and so those numbers are real as well. So the numbers included in the DIP, the University of Iowa power plant does provide their numbers of how much coal that they use, and there has been a reduction in that as well. So
Yeah,
it's
that's
those
great to
two
hear.
things together.
Yeah, I'm very pleased to hear that. Okay, so there's no need to elaborate on the points. Those are concerns I have, and I wanted to make sure that they were articulated. Okay, so thanks for the presentation for sure, Brenda, and for responding to the questions.
You brought up an interesting point, though, Jim. I mean, when we look at the reductions and you have the baseline, from what you've said, Brenda, then there's no adjustment in terms of population shifts to what the goals are for a community. I mean, once you've set that baseline, I mean, if you get over that period of time, if your population grows by 50% or 100% over all those years, there's still, like with the IPCC, there's really no adjustment in your goals?
Correct. And Iowa City is growing, and we've taken the population growth into account and projected that into 2050 in our plan.
Okay.
So, and we also calculate per capita to see how much our emissions are per person, to see how that's doing, so.
Thank you.
Okay, so now we
I have
should.
one question for Brenda.
Oh, sure, go
Do
ahead.
you know how many municipalities, both in the state of Iowa as well as throughout the United States, have adopted the IPCC standard?
Since it just came out a few months ago, I know a lot of cities already have plans, but I think that some cities are adopting more strict standards, but it would all be within the last few months. And so I know Columbia, Missouri just finished their plan, and I'm not sure if they did, but it would only be anybody that's created or finished a plan within the past few months, although it's possible, obviously, to go to stricter target emissions even after you've adopted a plan. So I don't know. I can't tell you offhand, but I think some cities are more stringent than before it came out, and some cities may already have higher reduction targets even before that happened. Like I think Fort Collins, for example.
Okay, I'd like to suggest, if this is all right with you, I mean, we're a council, so you tell me if it's okay. I'd like to suggest we ask a couple broader questions that we need to answer that nobody else can answer, just us. Like, and the first one would be, it comes from our climate strikers, should we declare a climate emergency? So I'm wondering what you all think about that.
Well, my response to that is that there's clearly, in my view, a need to declare something. What we call it, I think, is one of the questions. And, you know, I sent all of you a draft of, if we were to consider a resolution with respect to this declaration, that my suggestion would be calling a declaration over a climate crisis rather than a climate emergency. I mean, it's not something in my mind that's, I think it's important insofar as, to me, it has a better it better reflects, I think, what we're attempting to do and what it is we're responding to. I don't think it's the most critical thing we'll be talking about tonight, but it was something that I'm seeing. There is an acknowledgement that we need to describe climate change as something clearer in terms of its urgency, and climate crisis seems to be the phrase that has been identified or is being used as we move forward on these questions of how to respond to this situation. So personally, I prefer the idea of calling, if we were to make a declaration of climate crisis.
I think we should declare a climate emergency, and here's why. Jim, I think we're all concerned about what happens if our rhetoric gets too far out ahead from our actual ability to implement that, right? Do we have I hate to use this term, but a credibility gap if we make this sort of declaratory statement? You had mentioned the definition, the textbook definition of emergency, floods, tornadoes. Well, I think we are seeing precisely that throughout the state of Iowa, which is directly a result of this accelerating crisis. One of the reasons why we're talking about the IPCC, and there's, I think, some debate in terms of how urgent it is, but the question is, what is the actual time frame? Are we looking at 50 years, or are we looking at six years before we have a significant climate impact that is going to impact our state in ways that we could hardly imagine? On the other side of the state, we are seeing flooding that has never been seen before. Whole communities submerged. A friend of mine's father was totally displaced, and they were, I think, 20 miles from the Missouri River, and this is climate related. The other thing is that the rhetoric, I think, is important because I think it will precipitate action. I think we should also encourage every city in the state of Iowa, as well as our legislators, to unshackle us to be able to do more significant energy efficiency requirements within our local municipality. Now, whether we want to get into whether it's a climate crisis or climate emergency, I would want to look more closely in terms of the IPCC, in terms of the language they use, in terms of this language. But I think it is important, and I think we are seeing something that we have not seen before. So I think we should. We have the expertise here, I think, to make that happen. And I think, frankly, I have felt a lack of urgency, and what we've done so far has not worked. It has not been sufficient, and I think we need to move forward with that declaratory statement. Finally, a lot of the great crises, social crises throughout history, usually once it's recognized, it does take time to actually implement it, but it's usually the people that make those declaratory statements early on that are the visionaries, are the ones that make it happen. The worst that could happen would be that we would fail and not meet these standards, but I don't think we can have that sort of attitude at this point.
With all due respect, Rockne, I believe that if we as a city declare a climate emergency, it will have little effect on the actual crisis itself that is indeed very real and a real threat to the health and well-being of our cities. But even the article we received from Huffington Post about New York City said that declaring an emergency was largely symbolic, and that's what I would see it as. It's just a word. Merely making a declaration does not solve the problem. As Brenda Nations stated, this must be a community-wide endeavor, and what that means is educating everyone, and that means everyone, on what all members of the community can and need to do to cut carbon emissions.
What do the rest think?
Yeah, I think we're definitely, we need to move with urgency. And I think, Rockne, you bring up, the crisis versus the emergency, the rhetoric. It is important. But I hear what Pauline is saying as well, because we can declare an emergency. I think our ability, to really get there, it could be a little symbolic. And so I definitely don't want, just to have something that's declared as an emergency and then we don't have all the tools in place to get there. The reason I asked about the 2050 plan is because I really believe beginning with the end in mind is where we need to be, so that we can really try to figure out, since there is a huge component of the community to be a part of this, figure out how can we really space this out. So I know that we need to move with urgency. Crisis versus an emergency, I can go either way. I think crisis for me is probably more of the appropriate term right now in our ability to say that this is our plan forward. Because a lot of this does not have a lot to do with the 2025 or the 2030. That doesn't have a lot to do with the community members. And so I think if we were to really look at that 2050, really incorporate a 2050 plan with a lot of the community members in there, then I think, yes, it needs to be seen as an emergency, because we're going to have to really involve the community, and their rhetoric can go far. If we have the rhetoric now and we don't have, we're not really pulling in the community and really going to make an impact, I feel like it can be very symbolic. And then in 2030, when we really need the community to be pulled in, we've said, climate emergency for, forever. And now it's going to be, it won't have any teeth to it. So
you would lean more towards the crisis then?
I think right now, because of where we are.
I can take that.
I would as well. And while people are talking, I just had a curiosity I think all of us know what an emergency is.
Yeah.
But when you look up the definition of crisis, Merriam-Webster has it as the turning point, for better or worse. They talk about an acute disease or fever, but I think you could talk about it in terms of the situation that we find ourselves. A time of intense difficulty, trouble, or danger. Decisive point, turning point. And I think using the word emergency again, not to diminish the importance of this and moving more expeditiously to make changes, but I do think if you use the word emergency, people think, well, it's 5 years later, nothing's really happened. Yeah, the weather's a little bit worse. Why'd they call it an emergency? But I think if we have that methodical approach of this is a crisis and it is getting worse, and we need to have that long-term plan. Like you're saying, Bruce, we have to find ways to engage the public and the community sooner rather than waiting till 2030 or whatever. I think that makes sense, and I think we just keep talking about the flooding and windstorms. I just came back from vacation in New England, and I will tell you, the variation in weather was amazing. In one day, we had 3 significant thunderstorms, and in between, the sun was blue and sun was shining, and sky was blue and sun was shining. I mean, it was just beautiful. It was like you're getting these weird, really short but significant heavy rains, high winds, and then they're gone. And so totally different. And all my family members were talking about it. And so, and like you said, Rockne, the flooding, et cetera. So, but I think the crisis, I think you can message that better with people and really start getting them on board that this isn't over tomorrow, but it's a long-term thing, but we've really got to start moving on it.
I think that's the key thing. We have to demonstrate we're going to do more, because things seem to have shifted. Things seem, I wouldn't say that we're now in the middle of a particular inflection point where suddenly things shifted, but we definitely face collectively a severe and negative future for human beings and for other living creatures if we collectively don't get a grip and actually take effective actions to reduce emissions and to reduce them at a pretty aggressive rate. So I personally am not a fan of using the phrase climate emergency right now. I think that's a symbolic phrase that has resonance, but what really matters is the action. So I think we need to do more than what we have done so far, and we need to be as clear as we can to the staff about what more means and for us.
Do you agree with crisis then?
Yeah, I'm okay with crisis, yeah. So the next question I would ask is whether basically 45, whether we should adopt more stringent emission reduction goals in accord with what's being recommended to us by the climate strikers and apparently by the 2018 report from the IPCC. Or is it IPPCC? I get my letters confused. In other words, should we call for reducing our emissions by 45% as of the year 2030 and to zero by the year 2050? I think we should. Just get that out there. I think Brenda has said there is a pathway. And that was, a scenario, a hypothetical pathway, but it's possible that we could do that. We have to count on Mid-American, we have to count on the university, but we also need to focus on what we can do here. And I don't mean city government, altering city government activities as such and managing city-owned buildings differently. That's important, but it's not enough. We have to have more community engagement, it seems to me. And so, but I don't want to monopolize that discussion. The question is, should we adopt a more aggressive emission reduction goal?
I would agree, Jim. And again, getting back to, I don't want to give short thrift to symbolism. We're going to talk about action. But if we do this, I think we will be the first community in the state of Iowa to adopt this standard. Correct me if I'm wrong. And again, what I want to do is I want to project this to every city in the state of Iowa to do the same and have the collective action and to signal that we all are in this together. We're all on this great big planet Earth together. And, I would only say, without identifying the specific social movements, they all start and they all seem impossible. But it's small groups of people collectively declaring that they're going to do something about it. And then other people become inspired by those groups. And so I think we can do that. We have an enormous platform. And so I think we should. And as Brenda points out, it is a feasible solution. I mean, we can do it. It is a possibility. So I think we should.
I think we're already, as you pointed out, on our way to that 2025 goal, and that seems to be achievable. Back in my day when I worked with employees and had to establish goals, we had what we call RUMBA, R-U-M-B-A. Goals should be realistic, understandable, measurable, believable, and achievable. And I'm having trouble seeing that 2050 of 100% as achievable. I would say it's more ambitious. The A would be ambitious, and it's so dependent on a lot of people that I think that 100% figure might be just a little high, even though that's what's been recommended.
I think, again, we need to see what the 2050 would be for our community specifically, how to achieve that, and the time frames of how we're going to really throw the 95.5% of our community between now and that 2050. I think Rumba is a good example of how one can achieve a goal. But I also think that the basic is understanding what does that mean for individuals? So climate change for me, I can tell you before I took on council, I heard the term, I kind of knew a little bit about it, but I didn't know much about it. And what does that mean for my house? What do I need to do inside my house to achieve climate change when you're talking new furnaces, new water heaters, all that type of stuff? What does that mean for business owners? What can they do? These things come at a cost. And so I do think, laying it out so that people, one, have information about what does that mean for them personally, but also, doing that rumba so that, from R to A, everything is laid out. So I guess for me, I do think that I can't stress it enough. Need to figure out what is that 2050? How do we get to that 100%? And I think that needs to be figured out now.
My understanding and the little bit of looking into this that I've done since this issue has come up is that we have two tasks that we're looking at. One is the question of the declaration, which I think sounds like we agree, we need to make that declaration as an ordinance. And what I've seen in other cities that have made such declarations is they don't necessarily give percentages. I mean, they will refer to the 1.5 degrees Celsius that we cannot exceed. But in the declaration itself, they don't necessarily speak about we shall reach 45% by a certain date and 100% by 2050. What they have done is say, in making this declaration, we would like staff to prepare a technical report in response to this declaration. And in that response will be the information that you're talking about, that in certain sectors we shall achieve X percentage of CO2 reduction, and, for all the various sectors that were included in Brenda's presentation. So the path to not exceeding 1.5 degrees Celsius is revealed in the technical report. I don't know that it needs to be revealed now, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
How do we get there then, John?
We get there through the technical report. The technical report is a pathway.
Yeah.
The resolution is saying we have a crisis. We shall not exceed, in my draft that I prepared, it talked about, what some of the issues are that need to be acknowledged now, that kind of lay the groundwork for basically our response, this accelerated response, which is then articulated in much more detail by the staff report, which we'll get into questions we've been asking and that Jim mentions. Do we have a coordinator? That should be, we can express tonight whether we think that's a good idea or not, but I think ultimately it would end up in this technical report, along with a much more detailed expression of what that path shall be specific to Iowa City and the ways in which we need to meet the IPCC's recommendations.
What do you think, Susan?
Well, I guess, with due respect, John, I think we have to have a goal if we're going to lay out a path. I don't see how if you're going to tell people, to reduce your emissions in your house, by X percent, you should turn your thermostat down so many degrees or whatever. I think you have to give the individual and the individual homeowner really concrete ideas and information about how certain actions will make a difference. Otherwise, I think it's hard for people to know, what do I need to do my part if I'm willing to. So I think we need to set that goal. I think it makes sense to go with the IPCC's new recommended targets, at least as a starting point. And then I would agree with what you've talked about, Bruce, and kind of what you're referring to, John. I think what we need is a more definitive road plan here in terms of the steps at the city level. What can individuals do? How much we're hoping to increase bus ridership, how many, miles per capita we'd like to decrease, the use of cars, those different kinds of things. What does that mean in terms of, like we said, buildings are the biggest part of this. What does that mean to the individual, like I say, as they set their thermostat in their home? In terms of how much natural gas they use, programs about, turning off lights, using, more efficient light bulbs, all those different kinds of things. I think we can certainly talk about, as you asked the question earlier, Rockne, do we get to that point of incentives? Or programs like that where either tax abatements or other kinds of incentives for helping people, make their homes more efficient. We're doing some of it, but is there a way of doing that even more? But I think to lay out those steps to help us really get there, we need to know where we're going. And so from that, if we don't make it, at least we've tried. We're further along than we are now. But I think what we've got to try and do is set that target, and then we have got to try to find steps that are quite frankly, as easy for people as possible. I hate to say that, but I think that's the reality of where people in this country are now. If it's too much work, they're not going to do it. So the more we can get those steps laid out now and try to show people with incremental change how they can do their part, then we have the best chance of success. Keep in mind that, Mid-American is not providing natural gas or electricity that we aren't using. So while we say a lot of it is on them, yes, it is in terms of the way they generate their electricity, but it is the demand that is driving that.
Yep.
So I would support changing our recommended targets.
Well, has everybody spoken? I guess you have, right? So I would too. I think, to me, John, again, with due respect, I don't think it makes sense to ask the staff to put together a technical report without giving them some guidance about what we expect that technical report will achieve. So I personally would favor adopting the stricter goals of 45% and zero. And for 2030, I think the gap's not that big. It's pretty big when you get on farther down. Beyond that, the crucial question then becomes, okay, so we'd have to make assumptions about what Mid-American's going to achieve, assumptions about what the University of Iowa is going to achieve. What's left? It's the what's left. Which of what's left, what can we influence? What can we control? And so, then my mind starts going to the Climate Action Advisory Board. And if we directed them to focus attention on that in collaboration with the city staff, we could come up with the equivalent of a technical report. So along those lines, I want to toss out an idea because I don't know if it would be legal, and I'm curious. So we cannot adopt stricter energy standards for new buildings. This is the clear opinion. Could we require that any new residential or mixed-use developments requesting a rezoning must achieve a significantly higher energy efficiency than the state code currently requires? Now, there's a little ambiguity, a couple points there, but you get the general picture, right? Could we do that?
Be like.
You would have to do I don't know. I mean, you'd have to, as we did for, I'll give you the example of, the riverfront crossings, affordable housing requirements, where we actually tied the increase, the increase in the density that they were achieving to the affordable housing requirement. I don't think you could just impose an energy conservation requirement on any rezoning.
So then, as a twist on my question, I found myself wondering, could we mandate that new rezonings in Riverfront Crossings District must include achievement of more strict energy standards, which would have to be specified?
Jim, I don't think you want me to give you that answer right now.
Okay.
I mean,
it's me talking.
If you
just
want me
talking
to
out.
just off the cuff tell you what I think about that, I can do that.
Fair
but
enough.
I don't think that's a wise way to give a legal opinion.
Fair enough.
Yeah.
So I'm articulating a hypothetical.
I get it, but be careful what you ask for.
Right.
Did we get support for 4, though, first of all, to clarify in the IPCC?
I think so.
Did we?
I-
Okay.
1, 2, 3.
3, and then, John, are you supportive of that now?
I'm supportive of it. In fact, I think,
Okay.
the 1.5 Celsius, implicit in that is changing the goals. You can't get there.
So you support, I just want to
I
make
do,
sure.
I'm
we
fine
know
with that,
Okay.
yeah. again, I feel that there needs to be much greater articulation as we get into the technical report as to how we achieve that.
Can I jump in real quick on this idea of a technical report, because the plan provided that, and there's a lot of information available with the plan, but then the staff has an exceptional amount of more detail. So we have the numbers on what's needed to get to those 2025 and those 2050 targets as they were initially set. We can go through each of the actions and say, okay, for alternative fuels or electric vehicles, in order to meet our goal, we need 2% of vehicle miles traveled by 2025, and then by 2050, that's got to be 50% of vehicle miles traveled. And we can go through the various actions and provide that. That's what we're using to guide ourselves as staff going through. That level of detail is not always suitable for the public-facing plan document, but I want to let you know that that's out there, and that was part of the plan that you all, procured.
Yeah, but Jeff, I take the point, and clearly it's true, but we also need to know what specifically the staff will be doing to make sure that those steps are accomplished. It's not that we need to reduce, VMT by 2% or whatever it was you just said in general. We need to know how to do it, what we are going to do to accomplish it. Right. And that's where I think the Climate Advisory Board can help. And just as a parenthetical here, the commission, I think, is going to recommend to us that they be transformed into an official commission of city government rather than be an independent advisory board. And we'd have to specify what that commission's role would be. But it could be tightly tied to this point, I think.
Can I mention one action that I would at least like to evaluate? This may also be harder for staff to give us an off-the-cuff response. I certainly wouldn't want that. But I would like to consider and have staff further research city-wide tax abatement for solar infrastructure on residential or in commercial construction. So at least I'd like to evaluate that, or to see whether if the increased costs by virtue of higher standards, if someone wanted to opt into that, so they wouldn't have to, but if they wanted to take advantage of the incentive, they would have to apply the 2018 standard or whatever. It's hard to work out all the details today, but I would at least like to evaluate that, because that strikes me as authority that we do have, and it would be citywide across the board, and everyone would be able to participate on that.
So I'm going to set Jeff up here to actually push a point that he and I have talked about. It's not really generating solar electricity that we need. I mean, I favor it. I'd like to see a lot more of it, but it's not what we need. We need to replace natural gas. And the way to replace natural gas is with heat pumps. And I mean, our staff can tell us more, but maybe that's what we need tax abatement for, or financial incentives for.
They may come up with additional things that they would look at, but I would see that as an incentive, whether it's solar or anything else. It does strike me, though, that in terms of where we are with time, we should also have another work session to further flesh this stuff out. But that would be something I'd like to evaluate.
I mean, I think it makes sense to look at what incentives generally. I mean, the tax abatement may not be the right tool because of that requirement that you increase the value by 15%. Mm-hmm. I mean, you only get the abatement on the 15% increase in value. So I would look at it more generally as types of incentives.
In your report, Brenda, you mentioned the grant for a fellow that is helping with this project, and it talked about engaging with community and students. Is that something part of their role, what they're doing now, or what exactly are they doing?
Yes, our equity fellow is looking at the extremes that the different effects of climate that are going to have on our communities, such as like increased heat, increased precipitation, vector-borne diseases, and things like that, 8 different things. And we're looking at what communities that's going to impact the most. And so, for instance, like for extreme heat, that's going to affect people who have to pay more for air conditioning that might be burdensome or need a heat center if they're homeless or something like that. So we're looking at both public health effects and other effects, because I think most cities are seeing that it's those that are having the least impact on climate that are having the most impacted lives from that. And so we're looking at to get recommendations on what we can do for those in our community that are most impacted from climate change.
Thank you. 'Cause what I've been thinking is that we really need someone who's responsible for community engagement and outreach, whether that's a part-time person or perhaps there are other grants out there, that, because I know we've done the budget already, we'd have to try to find funds to fund that person. But I think that's important. I mean, Brenda has a job to do, and she can't be out there talking to all 70,000 of our community members. I think it would be important to consider that, think about hiring somebody to do that.
What do the rest of you think about that?
I think Pauline make a good point as far as Brenda's ability to really reach the masses in a way. I do think that maybe we might consider just earmarking some funds for a staff, and I'm not sure if that staff will be in a year from now or 2 years from now starting, but just earmark them while if the commission is formed officially as a city commission, that would already be a part of our plan to have a staff to do whatever is needed to reach the masses, because it's going to be, I mean, if we're going to reach the community, we're going to have boots on the ground, sort of say. So I think that is something that we should just contemplate for a staff of some type, to be boots on the ground, essentially.
I would suggest that we wait. We're going to do our first meeting on budget, hard to believe, in August.
Yes.
As we talk about, issues that we, as a council, feel that staff needs to incorporate into next year's budget. I know I've had a conversation with Jeff, and the city manager's office has been, as they usually do in the spring and early summer, meeting with employees across the city. And this is not department heads, but boots on the ground employees. Mm-hmm. And one of the comments he mentioned was everybody is saying we need more staff. Sure. And these aren't, like I say, these aren't department heads. These are the people who are saying we need more help doing our day-to-day job. So I am very concerned that we sit up here tonight focused on one particular issue, no matter how important it is, and start making a preliminary decision about another staff person for this one area. I think we really need to wait until we're looking at the overall budget and all the needs across the city and figure out, how all of that works together and how we prioritize things.
So, along those lines, what about, because I'm sort of viewing what we're doing today, other than the crisis and then the IPC standard, that's sort of the decision that we've made. The rest of it in terms of action is a little bit for further investigation with staff. What about for staff to evaluate and identify what a full-time position would look like, and then to come back to us with a recommendation on that? Because I actually think you're right, every staff, you always talk about competing priorities. That's absolutely a valid point. Everyone has priorities for additional staff people. But I do think if we're going to make this happen and actually achieve these goals, I love fellows, but they sound a little bit internish to me. Now, I love interns, but I don't think they're going to get the job done. I think we do need to evaluate and explore a full-time position for implementing the plan. And we may decide that there are budget constrictions and it's not feasible, but I would rather the staff come back and say, okay, here's what a proposed thing would look like, and if you want to do it, we would have to figure out when it would become operative and whether we want to move forward with that decision.
I think you have to look, though, first even at the plan. I think as Bruce said, if we're going to have a goal for 2050 and we want to try and start getting those steps in place now, so, we don't hit 2040 and we're trying to do all this in 10 years. So if we start having this plan of these steps that we're going to be taking year by year and the improvements we need to make, I think that plan is going to help inform what we do or do not need for staff and what can or cannot be done by staff that we already have. So rather than going out and evaluating a staff person for this, I think you almost need to have the plan first and see what kind of staffing it's going to take to some of the early parts of this, maybe communication staff. I mean, some of the first 2 or 3 years of this might really be giving our communication staff direction on working with Brenda and other people in the Climate Action Committee about the messaging that is going out. So, and I'm not saying that's what will happen, but I think you need the plan before you know if you really need a full-time person.
Susan, on that point, I think it's correct to say that the advisory board not only intends to recommend that we revamp it as a commission, but also has pretty clear ideas about the need for additional staff person, and they have pretty clear ideas about what that staff person could do. I'd really like to wait on that particular question until we get a specific recommendation from the advisory board. And then that'll be, the sooner the better, because then it can be part of our budget discussion. We can have it in mind at least when we're doing our budget discussion. So I hope y'all can get it to us lickety-split, so to speak.
I don't want to belabor the point, but I hear what you're saying, Susan. I think we all get it. City staff can be increased in various areas. Since we know that we're going to be doing something here, I think what I mentioned a second ago was just earmarking some funds. It doesn't really have to be labeled for staffing, but it could, because if it's going to be informational, there's going to be things that we just don't want to be going to the general fund for it, like just having some earmarked, maybe a little increase. But again, I don't think we need to figure that out. I think if there's 4 more that says, hey, Jeff, you kind of heard the conversation, is that something you all can present to us as far as like earmarking some funds for climate action, or if we already have some, which I think we do, just doing a small increase so that there are some funds just set aside for this specifically. Again, if we, get down the road and we need a staff, whether that's time to really create a new position within the budget projected, or we have to, create something right in the moment. It'll give us a little money that's already earmarked for what we know will be, it's going to be expensive to move forward with the climate action plan from the city, I believe. So.
And I would just say, I think the time to set aside those funds is when we do the budgeting starting in August.
Yes.
Yeah, Bruce, my sense is that Jeff has heard this conversation pretty clearly. And,
Yes.
And has a sense of where the council is headed.
Yes.
And
Yes.
will be able to share thoughts with us about that.
I think one thing that's important, what I listen for in these conversations are where's your emphasis? And what I hear from you and from the community, the Climate Action Board, is a different approach than, frankly, I was taking with the budget. And that's helpful for me to hear that, because when we went into this past budget, again, we adopted this plan kind of midway through staff compiling the budget, my focus was on how do we move forward on that 4.5% of the slice, the city operations. And so we looked at things like waste and landfill. We looked at stormwater. We looked at our facilities department, and that's where you saw 4 new positions, and that's a lot of what guided those positions. I'm just hearing a different focus from you all and from the community, and that's helpful, and that's your job, and that's why we have a Climate Action Board. So what I can do is I can take what you've talked about up here and provide you some options for how to move forward in short term and in the long term. And we could come back, in the next month and give you some of those options on how do we shift that strategy to more of a community-focused approach to this as opposed to what I originally had set forth, which was very much a, let's start with the internal, let's get our own house in order and then move out. And so I appreciate the input that we've heard, and I think we can readjust accordingly.
Does that sound reasonable to you folks?
Yep.
Yeah. Okay, good. Very excellent conversation. Thanks, Brenda, for making the presentation. Jeff and Eleanor for
Can I just
providing
ask one
insight.
question? Do
Sure.
you want us to go ahead and do what we need to do to get the board set up as a formal board?
Well,
I mean,
you could begin preparations because we're going to get a formal recommendation from the commission, right? I mean, tell me if I'm wrong.
That was a consensus at one of our previous meetings.
Yeah, so I did.
Okay, wait till we get that recommendation and then.
Yeah, but you can
go
be
from-
thinking about it, you know.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
And then, Mayor, some clarity on what you'd like for staff going forward. You talked about a declaration of a climate crisis. Do you want us to draft that? Do you want us to work off Councilman Thomas's draft? Do you all want to draft that resolution, I presume? And then in terms of the IPC standards, will that be addressed within that resolution, or would you like us to bring a separate, basically update your 2015 targeted goals?
I would like to couple it with the IPCC, and then we could maybe work with John Thomas's draft, but that's what I would like. We can get additional feedback, too.
Yeah, probably. We don't need some of the items near the bottom of that draft, which we can't really discuss because we haven't had time to think about it. But we could prepare a draft, I think, and spinning off of what you proposed tentatively.
Okay, so what I heard there is we can bring, at your next meeting, we'll bring forward a resolution adopting the IPCC standards. Sorry, extra C in there. And then separately, the council, some group of you will work on a resolution for the climate crisis declaration. Did I get that right?
I think they should be together. They should be. I'm sorry,
want them
I
together?
probably misspoke. They should be together.
Yeah.
Okay, all right.
So,
And who's going to work on
yeah,
that?
John, maybe you could just, what do you think? Could you work with staff on that? Because you've already got some, the first whereases, I don't know, 4 or 5 of them seem
Those are good.
reasonable.
I haven't had a chance to even look at that.
Yeah.
When we get stuff dropped on Mondays,
Yeah, I did
have a
the
chance
best
to
I
see it.
could. I didn't want to
Yeah,
Dropped.
I haven't even read it, so.
Yeah, so it's just, I think all that needs to be done is like part of it deleted and then adding the specific decision that we made with regard to
the goals.
strengthening our goal.
And do you want to see that at your work session next meeting, or just put it on the formal meeting agenda?
Don't you think it'd be good for the work session, so we could just see it, and then maybe give some additional editing advice?
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, good deal. Let's move on. We have, look at that, maybe 10 minutes we could spend. Clarification of agenda items.
Well, since there is a letter from Fred Meyer under correspondence over the,
Is this an agenda item, John?
Or is it?
Correspondence.
it's under correspondence.
Okay.
7A.
I thought, rather than wait any longer, I think there might be some people in the audience who are interested in this. I hope that this is regarding the question of what impacts the bicycle parking might have on Robert A. Lee Recreation Center and the community garden on the north side of that building. And my hope is that we have 2 really valuable goals here, or programs represented. We have our expanding and improving our bicycle networks and the availability of bicycles in the downtown area. And we have an existing community garden, which is valued by the community and conceivably could lose some of its integrity if the bicycle parking were to proceed where it's currently proposed. So what I'm asking for support here is that we revisit where that bicycle parking would go so that we do not, in the process, in gaining bicycle parking, end up impacting the integrity of the community garden.
Do we know if staff has any different responses or?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know what staff's
Obviously,
thoughts are.
we already need to increase our bike parking downtown. That's been a recognized need for several years now. And then we have the bike share that we expect to be launching in the next couple of months. So we start to look at where are the opportunities to increase bike parking. And of course, you want them to be in spots that will be usable for the bike community. When you're in the very core of the downtown, as you know, walking around downtown, there's not a whole lot of usable sidewalk space in the core. So you have to go out to the periphery to see what those expansion opportunities are. And this is one of the areas that we identified for an expansion. It's not going to, it's not a huge deal to find an alternative location. So we can move on from this location if that's the consensus. It's just, it can be a difficult task to find the real estate in a congested downtown area already to add a lot of bike parking. So again, we do have other options, and if the council wants to preserve the cherry tree that's there, that's fine. We can do that and we'll move on.
I would support John. Obviously, this is sort of a conflict of two really good things that we all really care about. On the one hand, we're enhancing the bike infrastructure, which we love. But on the other hand, we have this incredibly dynamic educational growing space that is also very difficult to find in the downtown that we're losing more and more of, with a fruit tree that is literally bearing fruit. And it is the product of all this great work that has been done. Yeah, I'll eat it afterwards, Blair.
It's fruiting right now.
And so let's save that and explore alternative locations. I think tonight we probably can't get into what those locations would be, but I think staff can come back with a recommendation as to what that would be, and that would be my position.
Yeah, I'd like to see what other options there might be.
I would agree. You said we have other options. I would hope so.
Do you really want us to come back and give you options on where to put bike racks? I mean, I can just take your cue and say, okay, we won't eat up any more green space, but I'm not sure you want to get into the process of approving everywhere we put a bike rack in town.
I mean, my suggestion was that, if possible, staff meet with, and they may not need to meet with Fred. If we agree that we're not going to impact the community garden, backyard abundance doesn't need to be involved, but include the advisory committee or some representation of the bicycle community in the process. So it's kind of a process-oriented thing. If the bicycle community had not already been involved in this decision, include them.
Yeah, agree.
Is there, I think I'm hearing support for preserving, if you will, the cherry tree and looking for options. And John's suggesting that that the staff include the bicycle advisory committee in that process.
We're happy to do that. I just need to express, though, that as much as we love that input and we need that input, we make so many decisions on a day-to-day basis on these types of things. It is really not practical for us to stop what we're doing and get input on every decision we make and move at the pace that I think that you all are wanting us to move at. So we hear it loud and clear not to get into the edible garden, and I'll take that to expand any green space that we have downtown, and that's a perfectly reasonable position. We're happy to update the bicycle advisory committee and share those things, but if their approval is contingent on where we put bike racks, that bike share program is probably going to take a little bit, we've already been trying to launch this thing for 4 years. It's going to take a little bit longer. We have to shift these things around on a regular basis.
I'm thinking right across the street from here, hopefully very soon, the Chauncey Swan Park is going to be open and available, and that's going to provide a lot of space, and I think that'll be a great opportunity to place bicycle space.
Let's back off from having the bike advisory committee review this particular decision. Let's get some options, have the staff develop some options, choose which ones they want to follow through on. I mean, I take the point. I think we can kind of get our hands too deeply into what staff is doing, and that can complicate things.
Is that the way everyone feels?
Yeah, I think we was set up a little bit of ground rules, as Jeff laid out, just be sensitive to, the green spaces and move forward.
Speaking of moving forward, it's 22. I think we're probably going to have to stop it unless somebody has any specific question about an agenda item that really matters for the agenda. It's a really short, simple agenda, but anything like that. Okay, if not, let's adjourn our work session until after the formal meeting, and we'll talk about the information packets afterwards. We can pick up with the information packet discussion, and I know at least one person, maybe two, have been waiting for us to discuss the trap, neuter, return community cats, pet shops, and puppies memo from the city manager. This is information packet item number 3, and staff needs council direction on this.
I am in support of the trap, neuter, return program.
Me too.
I am too.
I am as well.
I definitely am.
I just think there was so much good information, evidence that this works, so.
Yeah, other communities. And I read somewhere that, you cat lover there, that a feral cat might not show you love, but you can still love them, and you can see how they appreciate, like if you're feeding them or giving them shelter. So they're good cats too.
And you'll still have all of the traditional tools as well. This just gives you more tools to be more humane to the population.
Exactly.
So I'm supportive.
Anybody feel a need to say anything else? I'm really sorry y'all had to wait for this.
Thank you for
but
waiting.
Luckily for you, it's only 8:20. I mean,
What if we'd said no?
9:45 or something. So anyhow, there we go with that. Can we move to any other item in that information packet?
Well, there's
which is
pet
what
shops and puppies, it was
Oh,
part of
oh,
that.
that
Puppy
too, yeah.
mills, yes.
Oh, yeah.
I'm really torn on this one. I am just super torn, because everything I have read, the Ag Department does not do a good job of inspection. And when they do inspect, there's still a lot of these places that are puppy mills. I don't know how good a job our local pet store is doing on vetting those places. I can't pass judgment on that.
Well, and Pauline and I have not gone up to Cedar Rapids yet either, so that's something we need on our agenda. We were going to report back
Okay.
to the council just to sort of see where they were. I share your
Let's
concerns.
delay then on the
Yeah, because
decision. Does that make?
I did not want to do a pet land, they're obviously be the most affected by it until we get all of the facts, and I don't think we've done that yet.
Okay.
So we'll have to.
Gotta work.
Yep.
Is that problematic from a staff point of view?
There's no rush, is there?
I have been in contact with the Cedar Rapids city attorney, and I know he's having discussions with the Humane Society folks. They have pretty different opinions about the preemption issue, so it raises the whole issue of House File 295, which was passed, if you remember, last year, which basically said cities can't adopt ordinances that set standards or requirements regarding the sale or marketing of consumer merchandise that's different than, or in addition to state law. And clearly that was directed at plastic bags, but it's not how the provision is written, and it really opens a whole can of worms. I have not done a formal opinion yet, but that section makes it tough.
I understand we're going to get back to this topic, and I respect that. One thing I will say is, when I spoke to some people that were not in that were in support of bans, a part of their rationale was nationally. To the reviewers of puppy mills, they really cannot push greater conditions. And so since they couldn't get anywhere with the national, they just thought, just ban it, locally. And so that brush where, there can be no national movement to local individuals and business owners. I just find that that is not the most appropriate tactic, although that tactic works for them to ban it in cities and not try to do it from a more of a standard of for site visits. So that didn't sit so well for me. The other thing is that when you're talking about banning in our community, then, and I did go to the animal shelter here 3 times. 3 weeks in a row. The first time I went, there was only 3 dogs. The second time I went, there was no dogs. The third time I went, there was 1 dog. Of all those 3 times, there was only 1 puppy about 1 year old, and that dog was gone the next day. So if we're talking about, banning in our community, but where are people going to get their animals if our animal shelter doesn't have enough? But even still, people are going to have to go to other communities. I think it is true that it is very beneficial for individuals to see where their puppy actually comes from and that type of stuff. But the reality is that I can be a puppy mill and I can show you what I want to show you if you want to come to my business and get a dog. So for me, I've not changed my position on I'm not going to support the puppy mill ban, but I do think that look at all of the things that do go into the decision of banning puppies in our community. So that's all I'll say for tonight, and we'll revisit this in the future.
Okay. Anything else on that information packet? June the 20th. How about the June 27th packet? I'm just going to mention that we're in another 22 days, we're going to have that special joint work session with the Planning and Zoning Commission and with Optico still. I guess they're still planning to come up, right?
Just as an FYI, I probably will be doing that electronically.
Okay. I'll mention IP number 8, which is an email from Judy Nyron, and I already referred to her just a few minutes ago. But in her communication, she thanked us for what we and others in the city have done to help their neighborhood and updating us on the Lucas Farm neighborhood. They're really doing well.
Oh, they're really
It's
well
really
organized.
admirable to see. Anything else on that packet?
Mayor, if I could just mention IP7, it's a letter from Kirkwood Community College on a program that they are initiating to increase ESL courses and tie them to employment opportunities. This is something that will probably come before you at some time, first to the EDC committee and then to the full council. I do think it's a program that staff would recommend supporting financially. So if you didn't get a chance to look at that, take a look at IP7, and if you'd like some additional information, I can get that to you in advance of this item coming before you.
Yeah, it looks to me like an excellent and much-needed effort.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I guess we can move on to updates about assigned boards, commissions, and committees. We could start with you, Bruce, and move to the
Sure.
right so that you can give it to Rockne.
Yes.
You speak.
And I have nothing to report.
Nothing to report either.
Other than going to the same meeting that, or State of the Downtown, I don't either on ICANN.
Access Center has not met, and I was out of town for the JEC meeting last Friday, so.
Okay, Pauline.
Nothing.
Wow, you people aren't doing anything. Okay.
About meetings.
Yeah, so Pauline, you mentioned that you and I will be meeting with Janet Godwin and Paul Rossler tomorrow in the afternoon. It's 4:30, right? Yeah, and the only other thing I'd mention is the Convention and Visitors Bureau Board. We met on June the 20th, talked about Fry Fest, the UCI World Cup, the arena, the East Side Sports Complex, and when we had that discussion, Josh Schamberger kind of said he's actively working with other people to advocate for progress on the East Side Sports Complex. He also provided a different topic. He also provided some more information about how much hotel, motel capacity has increased over the past very few years. I don't have the numbers in front of me, but it's like, kind of moving along and then So he's obviously concerned about that, as are owners and managers of existing hotels and motels. But
But I
that
had
was
a
topic.
conversation with him about that recently, too, and for our benefit, he didn't see that increase hurting Iowa City as much because people want to stay downtown.
Yeah,
So
yeah, that's
I think we'll see
That's-
higher rate, higher utilization, more nights rented or downtown Iowa City than maybe in some of the outlying areas.
Yeah, so I think I should mention one other thing, which has nothing to do with boards, commissions, et cetera. I think it was 2 weeks ago in our meeting, in our work session, I mentioned that I had received an inquiry from Mayor de Blasio from New York City about coming here, and I was going to give him a walking tour of the downtown. I got a phone call this afternoon asking if I could do that tomorrow afternoon. So we're scheduled to do it at 3:30, from 3:30 to 4:30 tomorrow afternoon. We're going to meet here at the front of City Hall. And I want to make sure y'all understand this. I've been very clear with them about how my position is a nonpartisan position, and that I would be eager to guide any fellow mayor around our city and to do the same thing with regard to any presidential candidate from either of the parties, or other parties for that matter. We like to show our town off. I don't know if he'll be able to get here. I mean, he had to cancel out last time, so maybe he will this time too. We'll find out. But I wanted to make sure you knew. Okay, I think that's it. So we're done for the night.